Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking a closer look at immune-mediated intraocular inflammation. We've got a really interesting review article to dig into, so if you want to read it yourself, you can find a link to the full study in the description.
It's a really great paper. It really gets into how the eye protects itself from immune system attacks. It's like a fortress.
Yeah, like it has its own little army. But
Mhm.
what I find really interesting is how that system can go wrong and lead to uveitis.
That's exactly right. This paper really highlights how our understanding of uveitis is changing.
Yeah, we're moving away from just infectious and non-infectious.
Exactly. We're starting to look more at the interplay of autoimmunity and autoinflammation, and sometimes it can be really tricky to figure out what the trigger is.
It really is like a mystery sometimes.
Mhm.
So how does the eye normally keep inflammation under control?
Well, the eye has what's called immune privilege.
Okay, so what is that?
Basically, it's like a special protection system to keep the eye safe from the immune system. And it's got multiple layers of protection.
Like a fortress. You said it before.
Yes, exactly like a fortress.
Right.
You've got the physical barriers first, the blood-ocular barrier, and the blood-retinal barrier. You can think of those as like the walls.
Okay, and the paper actually has a diagram of that, right?
Yes. It shows how these really tightly packed cells create a super strong seal.
Wow. But what happens if something gets through that wall?
Well, that's when the eye has some other tricks. It actually creates this special environment inside itself.
What do you mean?
Well, it releases all these factors that suppress the immune response.
Like it's trying to make peace.
Right. It's like creating a demilitarized zone. It keeps everything calm and prevents inflammation.
Interesting. But are there any other ways the eye protects itself?
Oh, yeah. One of the coolest is a CAID, or anterior chamber associated immune deviation.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It's like the eye can actually redirect the immune system. So when an antigen gets into the front of the eye, it gets picked up by cells and taken to the spleen. But instead of causing a big immune response, it actually triggers the creation of regulatory T cells.
That's kind of like a trick.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the eye is telling the immune system, everything's cool here, no need to worry.
Wow, the eye is really good at this. But even the best fortresses can be breached, right? So what happens when that protection fails and we get uveitis?
Well, that's what's so interesting, and this paper really gets into that. You know what we used to call non-infectious uveitis?
Right.
Yeah, they're moving away from that term now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, now they're saying undifferentiated uveitis.
Okay, so what does that mean?
It just means that even if we can't find an infection, there's probably still an immune response happening. We just haven't figured out what's triggering it yet.
Makes sense. It really shows how much we still don't know.
Right. It's really complicated, and that's why it's so important to understand the difference between autoimmune and autoinflammatory diseases.
Okay, that's true. But I always get those two mixed up. Can you remind me what the difference is?
Sure. So autoimmune diseases are like a case of mistaken identity. The immune system starts attacking the body's own tissues. Like it can't tell the difference between friend and foe. It's like it's looking in a mirror and getting scared of its own reflection.
No, that's a good way to put it. So it's basically attacking itself.
Yeah, and usually this happens because of autoantibodies. They're like these rogue antibodies that attack specific proteins in the body.
Interesting. Okay, so then what about autoinflammatory diseases?
Autoinflammatory diseases are more like an overreaction. You know, like when you stub your toe and it hurts way more than it should?
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. The immune system is just super sensitive and reacts to things that aren't really a threat.
So it's not attacking itself, it's just overreacting.
Right. And there's often a genetic component to it as well.
So some people are just more prone to it.
Exactly. Okay, so how does all this relate to the eye and uveitis?
Yeah, good question.
Well, the paper talks about how these different immune responses can show up in the eye. Like one example is sympathetic ophthalmia. It's an autoimmune condition.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
So remember how we were talking about a Coliad before?
Yeah, like the eye's secret agent.
All right. Well, with sympathetic ophthalmia, it's like the agent's cover gets blown.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so like if there's an injury to the eye, the immune system suddenly sees these hidden eye proteins and thinks they're foreign invaders.
So then it attacks.
Yep, and it can attack both eyes even if only one was injured.
That's crazy. So what about autoinflammatory conditions in the eye?
There are a few. One is called birdshot chorioretinopathy. It usually affects the back of the eye.
Birdshot.
Yeah, it's got a very descriptive name because it causes these little spots on the retina that look like birdshot.
Oh, wow.
And it's strongly linked to a specific genetic marker, HLA-A29.
HLA-A29. That sounds familiar.
Yeah, it helps the immune system recognize antigens. But in birdshot, it seems like having this marker makes you more likely to get this autoinflammatory condition.
Interesting. Okay, and what about other autoinflammatory conditions?
Well, there's also Blau syndrome. It's also known as early onset sarcoidosis.
Okay. And how is Blau different from birdshot?
Well, Blau syndrome is caused by a mutation in a single gene called the NOD2 gene.
NOD2, is that gene involved in the immune system too?
You bet. It codes for a protein that helps recognize bacteria. But in Blau syndrome, the mutation means the immune system is always on high alert.
Like a faulty alarm system.
Exactly. And that can cause inflammation all over the body, including the eyes.
Wow, so genetics really play a big role in all of this.
They really do. Oh, and you know what else I found really interesting in this paper? They talked about the gut microbiome.
The gut microbiome, what does that have to do with the eye?
Well, there's more and more evidence that the bacteria in our gut can actually affect inflammation in other parts of the body, like the eye.
So like, if you have bad bacteria in your gut, it could cause uveitis.
It's possible. One theory is that these bacteria can activate immune cells in the gut, and those cells can then travel to the eye and cause inflammation.
So it's not like the bacteria are directly infecting the eye.
Right. It's more like they're setting off a chain reaction in the immune system.
Okay, I see. But is there any real evidence for this?
Yeah, actually. The paper talks about the link between ankylosing spondylitis and anterior uveitis.
Ankylosing spondylitis, isn't that a spine problem?
It is,
Okay.
but a lot of people with ankylosing spondylitis also get uveitis. And ankylosing spondylitis itself is linked to inflammatory bowel disease, which is also connected to gut bacteria.
So it all comes back to the gut.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah,
It's pretty amazing how connected everything is.
it really is. So how are researchers studying all of this?
Well, they use animal models.
Like mice.
Exactly. Specifically, they use what's called an EAU model. It stands for Experimental Autoimmune Uveitis.
So they basically give mice uveitis.
Yeah, they can induce it by exposing them to certain eye proteins or immune cells.
So they can study it in a controlled environment.
Exactly. It's a really valuable tool.
But do mice get uveitis the same way humans do?
That's a good question. Mice are obviously different from humans, and their immune systems work a bit differently, so it's not a perfect model.
Right.
But it still gives us a lot of useful information.
Okay, and speaking of human studies, this review also mentioned a big study of patients with uveitis and scleritis, right?
Yes. It was a huge study, over 1,300 patients.
Wow, that's a lot of patients.
I know. And one of the most interesting things they found was that only about 5% of those cases were caused by autoimmune disease.
Only 5%? I thought it'd be more.
Me too. It really shows that we need to keep an open mind about what causes uveitis.
So what about the other cases?
Well, about 15% were autoinflammatory, and another 14% were a mix of both.
Okay.
But the majority, over 65%, were undifferentiated.
Meaning they couldn't figure out the cause.
Exactly. There's still so much we don't know.
It's kind of humbling, isn't it?
It is, but it also makes it really exciting because there's still so much to discover.
That's true. So about the methods and key findings of this study, was there anything about specific treatments?
They didn't really talk about specific treatments in this study, but they did emphasize the importance of those animal models.
Right, because those models can help test new drugs.
Exactly. And they mentioned one study where they were actually able to change the severity of uveitis in mice by changing their gut bacteria.
Wow, really? Yeah. So you're saying that maybe someday we could treat uveitis with diet?
It's possible. I mean, it's still early days, but the research is really promising.
That would be amazing.
Wouldn't it? It just goes to show you how much we're learning all the time.
It really does.
And it's a good reminder that we need to look at the whole patient, not just their eyes.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive, so much to think about. Before we wrap up, I always like to leave everyone with a question, something to really ponder based on what we've talked about.
I like that idea, a little food for thought.
So we talked about the gut microbiome and uveitis and all this promising research. It makes me wonder if maybe someday personalized diets could be part of how we manage uveitis.
That's a really interesting thought. What if we could look at a patient's gut bacteria and actually create a diet plan to help reduce inflammation in their eye?
It would be like personalized medicine for the gut.
Definitely.
I mean, could you imagine saying to a patient, eat this, not that, and your uveitis might get better?
That would be incredible. It would be like a whole new tool in our toolbox.
It would really show how important it is to think about the whole patient, not just their eyes.
Totally. We're treating people, not just eyes.
Well said. Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive. I've learned so much.
It's been a pleasure talking about this with you.
And for anyone listening who wants to learn more, You can find a link to the full study in the episode description. And don't forget to follow the podcast for more deep dives into the latest research.
And if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps other eye care professionals find the show.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of immune-mediated intraocular inflammation. We'll catch you next time.
Until then, keep those eyes peeled for new discoveries.